Hello. Thank you everyone so much for coming to Flyleaf Books to hear Margaret Edds talk about her new book, What the Eyes Can't See. She's joined tonight by Lloyd, Kramer, and Dianne Jackson. This event was made possible thanks to our wonderful partners at Carolina Public Humanities and to Lloyd Kramer, who is the director of Carolina Public Humanities and a professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill. He received his PhD at Cornell University and has served as chair of the UNC Chapel Hill History Department. And again, thank you so much for coming and for supporting your local independent bookstore.
Okay, thank you very much, Marilla. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am happy to welcome all of you to this book conversation at Flyleaf Books, which I want to stress how important this bookstore is as a community center for everyone who cares about ideas and books in Orange County. And I want to thank Marilla especially for welcoming us here and for her longtime collaboration with CPH. I think she's moving on to a better place, not a better place, another place. UNC. Not a better place. I just said how great it is here. But anyway, thank you for all you've done. As she said, I'm Lloyd Kramer. I'm a professor in the history department at UNC, but also the director of Carolina Public Humanities, and we organize many public conversations about humanistic issues and how they affect our public life. And I have a brochure here if anyone would like to see it afterwards. But we are co-sponsoring this event because the history of recent events in Virginia is important for those of us who live in North Carolina. And this evening's book event is a conversation about Margaret Edds' book, What the Eyes Can't See, Ralph Northam, Black Resolve and a Racial Reckoning in Virginia. And here is the book, which is available here, published by University of South Carolina Press in late 2022. So some of you may have already purchased the book, but it will continue to be available here at Flyleaf Books. And I should note we are recording this event so that it will be available for people to see it after this evening. As we'll be discussing, the book examines the ways in which Virginians responded to the revelation of a photo that appeared on Governor Ralph Northam's page in his medical school yearbook from the early 1980s and showed a white person in blackface standing next to someone in a Ku Klux Klan white robe, a highly disruptive and unfortunate photograph. You'll probably remember that when this story broke in February 2019, there were immediate and widespread calls for Governor Northam to resign, but he decided to remain in his position, and he wanted to be the person who could make some change in Virginia. He also later said he didn't think it was him in that photograph. We might talk about that issue. But this crisis pushed him to begin a long exploration of African American history in Virginia, to launch new meetings with leaders of the Black community and the Black Legislative Caucus, and to support major reforms such as gun control, changes in the criminal justice system, and historical education. He also responded to the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota by calling in June 2020 for the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, and becoming a leader in the wider campaign to remove Confederate monuments across Virginia. And the cover of the book shows that monument being taken down in Richmond, a truly historic event. He wanted Virginians to reject the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, which had dominated education and public commemorations of history in Virginia since the late 19th century. So you can see why this story of political transformation, Confederate monuments, and political leadership is as important for the people in North Carolina as it has been for the people of Virginia. It is a story about the struggle to understand and change the history of racism in a Southern American state. And Margaret Edds tells this story in her carefully researched and well-written book. So we're fortunate she's with us in Chapel Hill to discuss this book and to join a conversation with Dianne Jackson, who is here to help us get some perspective on the book, and I thank all of you for joining us. Margaret Edds is a longtime political and editorial writer for the Norfolk Virginian Pilot. She was based in Richmond, but she is now retired from the newspaper. She is a member of the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame and the author of 5 previous books that focus on Southern racial and cultural issues. Her first book in 1986 was made possible by a fellowship that enabled her to look at the results of the Voting Rights Act at its 20th anniversary. The Voting Rights Act, which has recently been mostly destroyed. This fellowship allowed her to travel across the South and to meet people like former Congressman John Lewis, Joseph Lowry, the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Jesse Jackson Jr., and Benny Thompson, who was then a county supervisor in Jackson, Mississippi, and more recently the head of the January 6th Commission in the House of Representatives. That immersion in Southern politics and culture has led to a continuing interest in and commitment to racial justice, which also explains her interest in the recent history of Governor Ralph Northam, political conflicts, and a racial reckoning in Virginia. And this evening she'll be discussing the key themes and implications of what the eyes can't see, and also offering her perspectives on the continuing struggle for racial justice in her home state and beyond. After Margaret offers some opening comments, our conversation about the campaign to expand historical knowledge and social reform in Virginia will be launched by Dianne Jackson, a longtime Chapel Hill educator who lives in Chatham County. Dianne Jackson is a native of Virginia who was born and raised in Richmond. She attended Bennett College in Greensboro and later relocated permanently to North Carolina. She worked for decades. There are a lot of days, too. Every decade is made up of days. She worked for decades in the Chapel Hill Carborough School District, where she enjoyed her career as an elementary school librarian at Glenwood School. And just as an aside, I'll say that my son attended that school, and one of his teachers is in the room with us tonight. It's a small world. But that's not the subject of tonight's discussion. She's now retired. I'm talking now about Dianne Jackson. But during her tenure in our local school district, Dianne's involvement in educational committees focused on issues that address systemic and structural racism. This work became her passion and the area in which she would have the most impact as an educator. Her experiences in both Virginia and North Carolina have given her the intellectual and professional foundation for a well-informed response to Margaret's new book. As an active participant in the education arena, Dianne served before her retirement on numerous statewide committees and task forces. She served, for example, as the local and state president of chapters of the National American Federation of Teachers Union. She was on the Governor's Teachers Advisory Committee under the leadership of Governors James Hunt, Michael Easley, and Beverly Perdue. And she received from Governor Hunt North Carolina's highest state honor when she was inducted into the Order of the Long Leaf Pine. Recipients of this award are recognized for their exemplary service and exceptional accomplishments in North Carolina communities. That's a quote. Dianne Jackson thus has a deep-rooted commitment to community service. She's also served as a Blue Ribbon Mentor advocate since 2006 and remains active on several community boards and organizations. She will therefore launch our conversation of the themes in Margaret's book by drawing on her own experiences in Virginia and in the North Carolina public schools. But we'll begin with some comments from Margaret Edds about the goal and themes of her book. Margaret, welcome to Chapel Hill.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. This is really a delight. Thank you to Flyleaf Books. What a beautiful store. And to Lloyd and Dianne, I'm really honored to be in such esteemed company. I want to especially thank my friend Betsy Brinson, who is out there, Betsy, who really is responsible for getting this going and for introducing me to Lloyd and helping us get everything started. My husband, Bob, who helped drive me down and who did lots of editing on this book and is responsible. And if a young person walks in quickly, this will be my granddaughter, who is a fourth-year student at the med school here and intends to be here later tonight. So, in January 2019, Ralph Northam was a very lucky man. He was a pediatric neurologist who had a very strong practice. He had won 6 elections for public office by high margins in every case. He had, in his first year as governor, he had pushed through a bipartisan effort on Medicaid reform, which had brought 400,000 low-income Virginians to the threshold of getting coverage. And he had a 59% approval rating, which is no small thing in this day and age. Then, over the next 48 hours, his life collapsed. The photo that Lloyd told you about appeared. People were shocked. He seemed to be shocked himself. And within hours, calls for his resignation had started all over the country. Over the next 2 days, virtually every Democrat of note in the country, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, practically all of the candidates who were running for the Democratic nomination for president at that point, Virginia's 2 Democratic senators, all called on him to resign. So this mild-mannered, likable pediatric neurologist suddenly was a national political pariah. He was called on to resign by all these people. He did not, partly out of personal grit, partly out of luck, because a couple of the people who would have succeeded him turned out to have problems of their own. But what he resolved to do was to immerse himself in learning about white privilege and coming to understand as best he could what it is like to live as a Black person in America. When he left office January a year ago, with a combination of his efforts and the Black Caucus and white allies, he left behind what is really the most racially progressive administration in Virginia since the 1880s. Among the things they did, the death penalty was abolished, first state in the South to do that. Statues had come down. June 19th had become a national or state holiday. The legalization of marijuana, which, as you know, probably entraps Black people at a much higher rate than white people. Steps have been taken toward legalization. There had been a record number of pardons, including a pardon for 7 men who in 1951, the Martinsville 7, were convicted of rape in Virginia and all executed, one of the largest mass executions in America. No-knock warrants had been barred. Police oversight panels had been empowered. More money had been funded, put into funding for schools and for housing. Low-income housing. History standards have been reframed, although now we're having some dial back on that. There's been a much stronger focus on maternal health for Black women, which is another one of the disparities of great concern. Even something as small, it might seem, as they stopped he's helped stop the practice of driver's license being removed if you could not pay your court fines. Just taking that away helped hundreds of Virginians. So all these things, and having to do with race, and then also there were major reforms in voter registration, in gun control, and climate change. A pretty remarkable tenure. So this book really is about 3 things. First, it's about the Northam narrative, the Northam story. And that's a story of personal resiliency, of his determination to make something good out of something bad. And that's sort of a lesson that everyone can take. Secondly, it's the stories of the Black legislators and activists who really pushed and prodded him to make these changes, who saw in this moment an opportunity to do things that had been denied to them for years. And then, of course, when George Floyd's death came along, that just intensified their efforts. And then thirdly, and really I think the most important thing, it's about the racial reckoning that occurred. The primary purpose of this book for me, and this is where it transcends Virginia and comes to North Carolina and other states, really is about challenging other white people to follow Northam's example, to look closely at their lives and to look at the right white privilege that they've had, and then to see what their blind spots around race might be. So Northam was a man who had a lot of black friends. He had a good record on civil rights. And yet what became apparent in the course of this was that he was woefully unaware of much of the history, racial history of our country. I mean, he knew who had won the Civil War. But then when you got into Reconstruction, when you got into Jim Crow, massive resistance, redlining, denial of GI Bill benefits, and even up to the modern day of mass incarceration, he really did not know and did not understand those things. So through the tremendous amount of work that he did, of reading, really listening to many people in these listening circles that went on around Virginia, he really developed an awareness of how it is that all those statues of Confederate soldiers dot our landscapes. That it wasn't just right after the Civil War. It was really during the Jim Crow period when the divisions were coming back in of separating black and white people. He came to understand how it is that 1 in 3 young black men have the possibility of spending time in prison, a national tragedy, and how it is that in so many aspects of American life, there is such a great chasm between blacks and whites in terms of life expectancy, in terms of the income that has been, income rates, all these things. And the time that he spent from that, and here's my granddaughter. Welcome. From that study, he came to understand the structures and the culture that still continue, that persist, and that undergird these differences in racial accomplishment and achievement. So I want to read just a very short section about that, and then we'll get into our conversation. This is about one of the major things that he learned. In another unexpected way, the blackface scandal added to Northam's deepened compassion for black lives. For years, he had prided himself on being able to say truthfully that he did not see race. A large portion of the thousands of patients he had seen over the years were children of color. Their race played no conscious role in his care. In January 2019, a few weeks before the blackface photos surfaced, Northam had conducted an interview on the Eastern Shore that spoke to that intention. A local communications firm was completing a video documentary about Sam Outlaw, a renowned blacksmith in Onancock who was black. Asked for an interview, Northam recalled visiting Outlaw's shop as a young person and bringing in a shovel or a wheelbarrow for repair. Then he turned to racial awareness. The way we were raised, my brother and I, we didn't see color, and I don't think Mr. Outlaw saw color either. He just treated everybody as human beings, and I think that's a lesson everybody needs to hear. Alina Yarmosky, his young office guide, had suggested at the time that he might want to rethink that statement. He had not understood why. After months of meeting with Black Virginians, studying their history, being shown evidence of racial disparity in almost every aspect of American life, he understood. To see a shared humanity was essential, but to see no difference was to ignore the systems and the deep-seated, even unconscious personal biases that continue to oppress. To impose a veneer of sameness was to deliberately ignore the vast gaps that split Black and white Americans in almost every measure of quality of life. Once he had adjusted his focus, oh my Lord, he said, he saw race-based difference everywhere. Quote, the eyes can't see what the brain doesn't know, he became fond of saying. Well, once you are educated and understand, talk to people, then racial inequity, it's all over the place. It's everywhere you look.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Now we know the source of the title, What the Eyes Can't See. And now I want to pass it over to Richmond native Dianne Johnson. Take it away.
Good evening. I would first like to thank Margaret for an extremely captivating treatment of Governor Northam's time in office and his impact on Virginia's political landscape. I myself personally was awed by the details and the depth of his influence in his attempt to address issues of equity and systemic racism. I started reading the book with a sense of skepticism. How could someone not know if a photo alleged to be him in blackface have no memory of being in the photo? Margaret's examination of his background, his childhood, and racial experiences, or lack thereof, set the stage for how one can exist without formulating an examination of America's racial constructs. As a child growing up in segregated Richmond, I was nurtured, educated, and supported, experiencing a poor but extremely happy childhood. People of other races were not even on my radar screen, other than the person who owned the corner store, the people on television, and the man who delivered the milk. So I too was devoid of any impactful racial experiences until my adulthood. Governor Northam, in my opinion, was the right person at the right time. The book examines his commitment to understanding the many ways race daily impacts the lives of those who are not Caucasian, and the work that he dedicated to making substantive changes in practices, policies, and laws. By the end of the book, I was impressed by the degree of impact the governor was able to have on Virginia politics, his response to the multitude of challenges. I mean, he could not catch a break that he faced during his time in office, and his commitment to his journey to have his eyes open. The realization is that progress can be rolled back, overturned, or dismantled. The challenge we all face is, where do we go from here? The current political climate in North Carolina, in Virginia, and in our nation is such that we all have to be protective of our democracy, and that we are faced daily with its fragility. Let me say that one more time. We all have to be protective of our democracy, and that we are faced daily with its fragility. We don't have the luxury or the time to limit our vision. We should all be working to open the eyes of ourselves and others. So thank you.
Thank you, Dianne.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those perspectives and your own experience growing up in Richmond. So just one other question to Dianne. Were you very aware of those Confederate monuments as a young person in Richmond?
Had no idea that they even existed. When the understanding as growing up, my neighborhood was totally Black. My experiences were totally Black. And that area where those monuments were, the only Black people that experienced those monuments were people who worked for those families. So we not even on our radar screen.
And you were saying that when you went back this time and you went over and saw, I mean, it was just a joyous event. Those of you who've been in Richmond and have seen the statues, I mean, it was just sort of this area of town that, as you said, many Black people did not go, but suddenly the floodgates opened, and there were dancers, there were just people celebrating, children climbing up on the pedestal.
Right.
I mean, really an amazing scene.
Once they defaced the statue before it came down, there were all kinds of events. They built a community garden there. People would come from out of town to go there to have that picture taken with that defaced statue before they took it down. So it was a really big deal.
So let me just ask a question to both of you to continue our conversation. And I want to note that after we've talked a while here, we're going to invite questions or comments from you as well, those of you in the audience. But I wanted to start with a question because I guess I'm a historian. I am a historian. And I want to believe that historical knowledge makes a difference. But do you think that Ralph Northam's journey toward a new awareness of Black history and systemic racism suggests that anyone's views can change? Or, in fact, do most people hold on to what they already know? Can people really change if they learn true history?
Well, I think they can change if they learn true history. Whether or not they will depends on the individual. And hopefully it doesn't take the kind of embarrassment that he went through for that to happen. But he certainly had strong incentive to propel him out of where he might have been stuck to look for something. So yes, I think anyone can change, but whether anyone has the motivation to do it, it might be a different story.
What do you think, Dianne? Can history make that big a difference?
I think history can, but the first piece in all of this is that you want to change. So I can teach you all the history that's out there, but unless you are willing to examine another narrative, to own another story, then history won't do it by itself.
And it depends also so much on who's teaching the history and how the history is being taught. One of the things that Northam did was we have every 7 years our history standards are revised in Virginia. And so he had a group of people that were working on this for almost 2 years, and really a very thoughtful group of historians and teachers and parents, and they came up with a whole set of standards which are now being dialed back by the current changed administration. There was such an outroar about the initial plan that they put forward that they have now revised that some and gotten to more of a middle place, but there is still a lot of complaint that this very good work that was done, has much of it has been ignored. So who's teaching the history? What history are you learning?
And as an educator, and I started as a history major in college, the idea of where we are now currently in this nation, as we look to Florida and we look to a lot of places who are dialing back the truth. I mean, how can you not want your students, your children, to know the truth? Even if it's an ugly truth, it is the truth. And so you cannot move forward without the honest discussion around where we are, where we came, how we came through some of these things to be the type of governor that he ended up being, because he wanted to change.
One of the things that's heard pretty frequently from white parents is, I don't want my children to feel badly about themselves. I don't want them to feel badly about history that they had nothing to do with. But the response to that is, what about the Black children who've been taught this history all these years, who have not been taught the reality of what not only the hardships that their parents or ancestors went through, but the things that they did to create agency, to really strengthen their lives and their community. These have not been part very much of the history that's been taught.
And what about the Black children who live that history? It's not, for me, as a person of color, Black person, that's what I call myself, growing up in segregated Richmond, I was very protected. My first experience with first racial experience, I was in my 20s at Carolina. And I rode around that campus with tears streaming from my eyes at the wealth that Carolina had compared to the state schools in Greensboro, North Carolina A&T, with one, at that point in the 80s, one little raggedy football stadium. And I came to Carolina and there were 3 athletic fields. And these were in the same state, governed by the same state board of governors. And so you say to yourself, these parents who say they don't want that child to feel ashamed, there's another family whose child had to live that experience. And that should also be equally as important.
Thank you. Let me ask another question more specific to this story of blackface that set the whole thing off. What is most striking about the various ways in which Black Virginians and white Virginians responded to this picture of a man in blackface? Was there a similarity or a difference? And what would account for that difference?
Okay. Well, there was a huge range of responses from both black and white. But one of the most surprising things was when the first poll was taken afterwards, white Virginians were pretty much split on whether he should resign or not resign. Black Virginians said something like 57% to 32 or 35% he should not resign, which was a very surprising outcome. Somewhat generational, I think, particularly older Virginians and maybe older white people too, were somewhat more forgiving. His counsel, his legal counsel, who is black, said to me, you know, I've lived in Virginia all these years. If I couldn't forgive, I could not have lived here. I think he had some goodwill left from the fact that he had a good civil rights record. He actually had grown up with a lot of black friends on the Eastern Shore. His parents did not take him out of the public schools when true integration came, and that was very unusual. So many of these people stood by him. So there was a range of response, but really the elected officials, black elected officials, white elected officials, pretty much were all saying he should resign. Ordinary people had more of a mixture of ideas.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Dianne, because you don't have inside information necessarily, but why do you think that the black community in Virginia would actually be less astonished or angry about that blackface than some of the white people? Or, I mean, what does it tell us about their knowledge of history? I guess that's my way of saying it.
I'm going to be politically incorrect, and I'm going to speak from Dianne's version. I probably would guesstimate or estimate that a lot of people would not have been surprised. We don't travel in the same social circles, and some of the things that come from being excluded, we don't find surprising. So I don't think they would have been surprised. I think he was more surprised at the fact that he literally had no knowledge of how people would have felt around that. So to be able to be that protected, for me, was astonishing.
One of the frequently heard comments was, in the black community, what did you expect? Yeah.
So black people were not nearly as surprised that this would happen. Of course, this is what white people do, maybe. Huh? So let me ask a question about these amazing reforms, abolishing the death penalty, changing the voter registration or ID rules. There were many things, legalizing marijuana, which is amazing. How does the nature of political alliance play into this story? How important are black and white allies in everything that Northam does? And what is the lesson that can be drawn from this about the meaning of allies?
Well, it was extremely important to what occurred. In November of 2020, and then beginning in 2021, we had a Democratic majority in both the House and the Senate. It was the first time, again, since the 1880s, that a progressive group, it wasn't Democrats in the 1880s, but a progressive group had controlled both the legislature and the governorship. They worked together very closely on this. For the Virginia Black Legislative Caucus, it was years of legislation that they had proposed that was just ignored. I mean, they already had the research done. They knew what the agenda was because they'd been working on it for years. They just had not had someone or the opportunity to pass these things. And also there were important people and white people in Northam's office, his chief of staff, black people as well, but there were white allies as well. So alliance was important in what happened in Virginia. I know that there is some question about the degree, are there times when white allies can be a detriment as well as a benefit? And one of the state delegates said to me that when it becomes a problem, she thinks, is when white allies try to speak for black people, try to say, I'm in a position to do more of the speaking than you are. So I don't think that occurred particularly in this instance, but that's something to be aware of.
Dianne, what are your thoughts about the role of allies in these kinds of struggles?
I think the role of allies it's a very important role because, again, as you look at, for me, the work around eradicating some of the impact of racial trauma, it takes, to me, to heal the problem, the person who created the problem. For so many years, we have, and I'll speak as an educator here in Chapel Hill Public City Schools, we wanted to have conversation around race and equity, and that conversation had to be based on whether the larger community wanted to discuss it. And so when you try to make substantive change, to me, all voices working together for that change is important. He could not have done this work without white allies, but he definitely could not have gotten through this without the black community.
So it is a message of alliance building that may have relevance for other communities far beyond Virginia. Let me ask a question about forgiveness as a, let's say, as a form of action. This revelation required some kind of forgiveness from people to forgive Northam. But there is another question that's even broader than this. When you look at the history of systemic racism and what this has done to black people over the centuries, all the way back to 1619, if I may throw in a date there at random, is forgiveness a valid human response to racism and racial injustice, to blackface, and is it even viable for communities that have been systematically abused by racist policies for hundreds of years? This is a story somewhat about forgiveness on many levels, right? How important is forgiveness?
Can I answer that one first?
Okay, absolutely.
I think forgiveness is an act, a personal act for you. My forgiveness frees me. It does not free you. And I think typically what you see over and over again, the black community forgives because you cannot hold all of that inside of you with the way you experience trauma on a daily basis. There's a term called racial battle fatigue. So when you live in these spaces on a daily basis and you're experiencing some of these slights, you have to forgive, because if you don't, then you harm yourself. That's my interpretation of why forgiveness was important in this whole book. He had also to ask for forgiveness for those who were close to him. I mean, a lot of his close associates were people of color.
Mm-hmm.
I think forgiveness comes with action. And for me, that's why reparations of some form would be so important.
Mm-hmm.
And that probably varies from community to community as to what that looks like. There was, I don't know if any of you have seen Women Talking yet, the movie that's out now, but there's a line in it about forgiveness can sometimes be confused with permission. And I've thought a lot about that statement. It's important to forgive, but to forgive at a time when there's been, for me at least, action on the other side that says concretely, there is something that shows that I am really sorry for what had happened. Otherwise, if it comes too easily, it may just seem that you're being given permission to continue what you've done.
So forgiveness can be conditional, that is, on apology. But I think Dianne also described a kind of unconditional forgiveness, because some people just will never apologize. So then the problem is, how much are we able to forgive in any category of injustice? Because the forgiveness doesn't eliminate the injustice. But I think this book is one of the most complex explorations of the problem of forgiveness that I've read. So I just want to thank you for confronting the reader with that problem. Not only Northam's forgiveness, but the Black community's struggle with the history on forgiveness. Let me ask a question that might be relevant to us, and then I want to throw this open to others. What do you think the story of Ralph Northam, Black Resolve, and a Racial Reckoning in Virginia might have to say to people in North Carolina, where we've also had in our own community, for example, some Confederate monuments?
I think a lot of people would benefit from having a personal blackface scandal. It's like we sort of need something to shake us out of our complacency.
Oh.
And I mean, I can say, I think people need to look at their own lives. I think they need to recognize how they benefited. I mean, doing this book, I learned things from it. I thought about my life. People need to do that. And white people need to listen to. So all these are things that are easily said, but if you don't have the impetus to do it yourself, then it may not happen. We also learn from studies that when you have a point of view, someone can give you all sorts of evidence against that point of view, and sometimes it just cements your point of view. So while we can talk a lot about systemic racism, whether or not that gets through is not, sometimes it doesn't.
Dianne, after reading this book and living for years in North Carolina, what did you see as most relevant for our own state and our own culture right here in Orange County and Chatham County?
Again, it is owning your truth.
Mm-hmm.
I look at Chapel Hill and some of the struggles that we've had in Chapel Hill. And Chapel Hill is supposed to be the liberal seat of North Carolina. And if we think about just you can walk a couple of blocks down the street and somebody is food insecure. And we're one of the wealthiest places in the state. And so when you think about where we are, we're no different. It's the same. It literally, this story resonates, and it could be applied to lots of places because it's simply right next door
It's really what the eyes can't see, or what the eyes choose not to see.
So I have some other comments and questions, but I want to ask, is anyone in the audience, either people who have read the book or have not read the book, who would like to add a comment or a question? And if you'll speak up, I will repeat it because we're recording this and we don't have a microphone to circulate. Any comments? Yes. Pam.
I just think Virginia is so important that this happened. You know, it's just so consequential. Because in all my reading of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, so many of the heinous laws really started out in Virginia. And I mean, just having this kind of reckoning there, it seems like a really big deal to me.
So the comment is, it's really significant that this happened in Virginia because of the history of Virginia, as they used to say, the cradle of the Confederacy.
The capital.
Do you want to comment on that? Why is Virginia so important to what happens?
Well, so much of our nation's history really was written in Virginia. And, you know, you really can take 1619 as a start for our country, not just because the first enslaved or captured Africans came here, but it also was the same year, just a few months apart and a few miles apart, where we had our first meeting of representative democracy. So much has stemmed from those two things of our country.
Good and bad. Is that James Williams in the back? I want to thank James, who's been a helper in making all this happen, and also a friend and colleague of Dianne Jackson. Take it away.
So I'm going to, my question really isn't to the heavy and the deep stuff. As a writer, at what point did you realize you wanted to tell the story, write this book, why, and what challenges did you have, if any, getting access to the information? I haven't read the book yet. I plan to, because I have read one of your books about two of my favorite attorneys ever, and it really blew me away, so I know you can write your ass off. But, did you delete that word? So yes, just in terms of thinking of that, how did you come to the book, know that you wanted to tell this story, and then what challenges you had in actually writing it?
So let me just repeat the question again for our ongoing audience here. What brought you to write this book, and why did you do this? And yes, as a writer.
The previous book that I wrote was the one you referenced about Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson, two seminal civil rights lawyers from Richmond. And I worked on that book for 6 years. And I didn't think I had another 6 years in me to write a book. So I thought that would be the last one that I would write. But the night that Northam said that he was going to take down the Lee statue in Richmond, we lived not far from there. And about 9:30 at night, you could hear this noise coming. And then it grew and it grew. And for like 45 minutes, there was a procession of people and honking cars and just jubilation going down our street. And I just thought, what an amazing story, that from the blackface scandal to announcing that you're taking down the Lee statue. And I thought that would be a good book. So, I mean, there's a lot more to the book, and I learned a lot more and as I went. I think the hardest part, well, I covered politics in Virginia for many years, so I sort of knew the people to ask about getting going, and so the project got going. The hardest part of it for me as I went was just knowing what a fraught time we live in this country, and knowing that the message was so important, and wanting to be able to tell it in a way that people could hear. And so I don't know if I achieved that, but that was my goal, and that's what I kept questioning myself all through this, because there's so many people who don't believe that systemic racism exists, who, you know, critical race theory, all that. I wanted to at least try to to have something that could be heard across that chasm. And whether that's achieved, I don't know, but that was the hardest part, and that was my goal.
As a fellow writer and historian, I just want to say I'm impressed by how quickly you pulled this whole story together. And I think James also asked at one point, getting access, right, to all of these people. And you had to do that quickly. Was that part of your challenge?
Well, yes, but I covered politics for many years,
Yeah.
and I hope I did it fairly. So I hope I had a reputation that I think helped open doors.
Okay, is there another, yes, question here. Wendy.
I wanted to affirm what you were saying, that the racism is here, you just can't see it maybe as easily as you can in some other places. But
if your eyes open, you can see it.
right.
Literally, it requires one to want to see it. And once, it's like he said in the book, once you open your eyes, it's there. You cannot unsee it.
And what I wanted to say was, I'm in architecture, and I had a class where we went to Chapel Hill, Fort Franklin, and Rosemary, and we were documenting trees, benches, crosswalks, parking spaces. And to me, it was profoundly obvious that the brick sidewalks on Franklin literally stopped as soon as you turned right. And that Rosemary sometimes didn't even have sidewalks. And there was one place where they had been fighting for years to get a crosswalk. You know, Franklin had them all left, right, center. Rosemary, And the person that I worked with, doing my part of it, was we were counting parking spaces, and she was terrified to count on Rosemary Street. She thought she would be killed. And she said that, and I just went, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And, so it's a much longer story, but I just wanted to affirm that.
So, thank you. I'm just going to repeat this. This is an affirmation of Dianne's account of what the eyes can't see in Chapel Hill, which is a history of racism, which is even in the buildings and crosswalks of the streets of Chapel Hill.
And the trees.
Yeah. And I'll share a story that's totally on the opposite side. My mom, who lives in Virginia, came to visit me, and I'd been in North Carolina for several years. And we went out to dinner, and she said, "Do you realize we the only Black people in this restaurant?" And literally, for her, and this is in the 90s, that was a real difficult situation for her. And so it's very rare for white people, unless you want to be a minority. But I tell my students, the kids of color, you can code switch. You can go both places. And it's very rare for white people to have that sense of comfort.
So, a question here? Yes, Betsy.
There were two examples that really got my attention, and I hope I remember the details correctly here. But I believe he had gone for an interview to Eastern Virginia Medical School where he did his training. And he didn't think it had gone well. But then he happened to have a meeting with somebody else of some significance, influence in the community, who, if I remember this, actually picked up the phone and called the medical school, and lo and behold, Northern was admitted. And as I remember this, it was an example of white privilege that, I think we've all seen happen in our own lives that isn't there to people of color. So that was an important story for me. The other thing, having lived in Richmond near the monument for many, many years before I moved to Chapel Hill 4 years ago, I was not there when all of this came down, but I have been back and driven down Monument Avenue, and you would hardly know. But I think it's important to recognize that the only monument that is there now is Arthur Ashe, you know, who grew up, became the tennis pro, and it's really a lovely monument of him with a tennis racket in one hand and a book at others, and children at his feet, because of course he did fund lots of scholarships for children and whatnot. And that's Monument Avenue at this point in time, and I just sort of think, isn't that ironic? Isn't that wonderful?
So just to summarize, it's very striking that when Ralph Northam had a problem getting into the medical school, someone could pick up the phone and make that happen. You give that as an example of white privilege. And Arthur Ashe is the only monument remaining on Monument Avenue. Any thoughts about those observations?
Well, both how ironic with Arthur Ashe and also the story of his getting into the medical school was what he told me. He said, you know, if you want an example of white privilege, that's as good as it gets. I would say about what the eyes can't see, he said this is what he used to teach his medical students, that if you don't know about a certain diagnosis, certain disease, it can be staring you right in the face and you won't see it. Same with systemic racism. If you don't know what that is and how it works, you just don't see it.
So one of the things about the book is each section begins with a historical framing of that part of the book. And I just want to mention the first part is 1619. And there is the program on 1619 on Hulu right now. So your book is also connected to the 1619 project, which, is that illegal to teach in Virginia now? 1619?
It may be becoming so. Is it legal or illegal? Under discussion, no doubt.
Dianne, let me ask you, as we're coming to an end, what is your main takeaway from this book and from what this tells us about the state you grew up in?
I'm going to need a minute on that. So.
Okay, I didn't mean to just
Right.
throw that at you, but I know you've been engaged with the book, so I'm just wondering, as a Virginian, a Black Virginian who grew up in Richmond, was there anything really surprising in the book, or what is your main takeaway?
Again, my main takeaway probably is the fragility of democracy, because immediately after he left office with the new governor, they have started rolling things back. I mean, dismantling some of the very things that he put in place to protect, to celebrate, to lift up, support, and also to keep people from harm. So my main takeaway is within just one political season, we're seeing the same thing in North Carolina. We will see the same thing nationally. Just the fragility of our democracy.
Well, is the famous quotation from Martin Luther King Jr., "The long arc of history bends towards justice"? Is that naive, or is that the lesson of this book?
Well, I continue to think that that's true, but it certainly does not happen in a straight arc. It goes this way and then it goes back, and I just hope, and I think that it really does not swing back. At least that's the hope I hold to. The hope I hold to.
So don't let the pendulum hit you on the way out. So we're out of time. Is there any final comment from anyone in the audience, in the community? Yes.
Well, first of all, I have not yet read the book, but you must answer the question, because I never heard the end of the story. Was he in the photograph or not?
So the question is, was Northam actually the person in the photograph, and what did you find out?
My conclusion was that he was not, but I don't know that definitively. and I don't know definitively who it was. The reason I came to that conclusion, I think primarily is that if he had been lying about it, there were people who would have known that. And he was taking such a tremendous risk. You know, it's like it would have been more than his governorship would have been lost if he denied this and then someone came forward and said, I mean, his entire reputation. And he is a person who values the truth a lot. He holds that as a core value. I can't say that he's always never answered to tell the truth, but I think that it is not him. I also think in some ways it doesn't matter. That really what matters is what came afterward. And I continue to think so many people would really benefit from a blackface scandal of their own.
So let me just say, as a historian, I'm so struck by the fact that something unexpected always happens, and out of that unexpected, something can be created. And I think that's the story of redemption that you're telling. So I want to say the glass is more than half full, but it's always on the point of being dumped back out. I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but what the eyes can't see is the glass can always spill. We're going to have to adjourn. I want to thank Dianne Jackson for your very helpful perspective. Thank you for being here. And Margaret Edds for writing this book. Thank you so much. And I want to urge everyone in the room to buy a copy of it for yourself. Maybe give it a great Valentine's Day gift for that special someone in your life. Happy Valentine's Day with what the eyes can't see. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at another Flyleaf event coming soon.
Thank you.
Are we off?